In the final years of World War II, as Allied bombers darkened the skies over Germany and entire cities burned beneath relentless firestorms, the Nazi regime did not surrender to collapse. It burrowed beneath the mountains, beneath the forests, beneath the earth itself. What emerged in those final, desperate months was a shadow war industry, an underground network of tunnels, caverns, slave labor camps, and secret factories that continued producing weapons even as the Third Reich disintegrated above them. By 1943, the tide of war had decisively turned. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility surrounding Adolf Hitler's armies. In North Africa, Axis forces retreated. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were increasingly hunted down. But perhaps most devastating of all was the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The skies over industrial cities like Hamburg and Essen roared nightly with British and American bombers. Factories that once churned out tanks, aircraft, and ammunition were reduced to twisted steel and ash. The Nazi response was not to scale back production, but to hide it. In 1942, Albert Speer was appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production. An architect by training and a technocrat by instinct, Speer reorganized Germany's industrial output with ruthless efficiency. He centralized control, streamlined production, and most controversially, expanded the use of forced labor from occupied territories and concentration camps. Under his direction, the regime began planning what would become one of the most chilling industrial transformations of the war: the relocation of critical weapons manufacturing underground. The logic was simple. Bombers could destroy factories, but mountains were harder to bomb. Across Germany and occupied Europe, vast subterranean projects began. Abandoned mines were expanded. Railway tunnels were converted. Entire mountain interiors were hollowed out using dynamite and slave labor. One of the most infamous of these sites was Mittelwerk, hidden in the Kohnstein mountain near the town of Nordhausen. Originally a gypsum mine, it became the secret production center for one of the war's most terrifying weapons, the V-2 rocket. The V-2, officially known as the Aggregat 4, was developed under the direction of rocket engineer Wernher von Braun. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, capable of traveling at supersonic speeds and striking targets without warning. Unlike conventional bombers, it could not be intercepted once launched. To the Nazi leadership, it represented technological salvation, a wonder weapon that might reverse Germany's fortunes. But the reality inside Mittelwerk was far from triumphant innovation. Prisoners from the nearby Dora concentration camp, later known as Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, were forced to assemble rockets in horrific conditions. They lived and worked inside the tunnels, deprived of sunlight, proper food, or medical care. Thousands died from exhaustion, disease, beatings, and executions. In grim irony, more people perished constructing the V-2 rockets than were killed by them in combat. As 1944 progressed, the underground network expanded further. Following the Allied invasion of Normandy and the intensification of bombing raids, the Nazi regime accelerated what was known as the U-Verlagerung program, short for Untödliche Verlagerung, meaning underground relocation. Code names like Project Reese, Bergkristall, and Weingut concealed enormous subterranean facilities carved into hillsides and mountain ranges. In occupied Poland, beneath the Owl Mountains, Project Reese attempted to construct a sprawling complex of tunnels that may have been intended as a new Führer headquarters or armaments hub. In Austria, the Bergkristall facility near St. Georgen and Der Gusen produced components for the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 could outrun Allied aircraft and carried devastating firepower. Yet by the time it entered service in significant numbers, fuel shortages, pilot shortages, and Hitler's own strategic interference limited its impact. The deeper Germany dug, the more desperate the situation became. By late 1944, Allied forces were pressing in from both west and east. American and British troops crossed into western Germany. From the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced relentlessly after massive victories at Kursk and Leningrad. The Third Reich was being crushed between two unstoppable fronts. Yet underground, production continued. Inside these hidden factories, prisoners assembled jet engines, aircraft fuselages, rocket components, and advanced weapon prototypes. Some facilities were so vast that railway lines ran directly into the mountain interiors. Electric lighting illuminated kilometer-long tunnels. Ventilation systems struggled to clear dust and toxic fumes. Guards patrolled constantly, enforcing brutal discipline. The regime's faith in Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, grew almost mystical. The V-1 flying bomb rained down on London. The V-2 struck without warning. Plans circulated for even more ambitious designs: intercontinental rockets capable of reaching the United States, advanced submarines that could remain submerged for weeks, and experimental aircraft that resembled science fiction. But these technological ambitions could not compensate for strategic collapse. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Synthetic oil plants were bombed repeatedly. Rail lines were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Even underground factories depended on vulnerable supply networks above ground. As Allied forces overran territory, labor camps were evacuated in brutal death marches, further increasing the human toll. By early 1945, the war inside Germany had become surreal. Above ground, cities lay in ruins. Civilians hid in cellars as artillery thundered. Refugees flooded westward to escape the Red Army. Below ground, production lines still operated, assembling weapons for an army that was rapidly losing the ability to use them. In April 1945, American troops approached Nordhausen. As they advanced, SS guards attempted to evacuate Mittelbau-Dora, forcing prisoners on deadly marches. When U.S. forces entered the tunnels, they discovered thousands of corpses and survivors barely clinging to life. The underground Reich was exposed to daylight. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler retreated into his own underground refuge, the Führerbunker. As Soviet forces encircled the capital, the symbolic meaning was impossible to ignore. The regime that had once sought world domination had been driven beneath the earth. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in that bunker. Within days, Germany surrendered. The underground factories fell silent. In the aftermath, Allied investigators combed through the tunnels and complexes, documenting the scale of forced labor and technological experimentation. Many German scientists, including Wernher von Braun, were taken to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Their knowledge would later contribute to the American space program, an uneasy legacy born from the darkest chapter of industrialized warfare. The story of the underground Reich is not one of triumphant engineering, but of desperation. It reveals how a regime facing inevitable defeat turned to secrecy, coercion, and technological gambles in a last attempt to survive. Beneath the mountains, innovation and atrocity coexisted. Rockets pointed toward the future were built on foundations of suffering. As 1944 turned into 1945, the underground transformation of the German war machine accelerated into something unprecedented in modern history. The Third Reich was no longer simply relocating factories. It was attempting to relocate its future. With Allied bombers ruling the skies and Soviet artillery rumbling from the east, the regime invested everything into a final technological gamble. If superior weapons could not win the war outright, perhaps they could fracture the Allied alliance, delay defeat, or force negotiations. One of the most formidable examples of this subterranean strategy stood along the Atlantic coast. Massive reinforced concrete structures, U-boat bunkers, rose from ports like Brest, Hamburg, and Lorient. These fortresses were so thickly armored that even the heaviest bombs struggled to penetrate them. Inside, German submarines were repaired, refitted, and redeployed into the Atlantic in a desperate bid to choke Allied supply lines. Yet by late 1944, advances in radar, sonar, and code breaking, particularly the breaking of the Enigma cipher, had turned the tide irreversibly against the U-boat fleet. Still, German engineers pushed forward with new submarine designs. The Type XXI Electroboot represented a revolution in underwater warfare. Unlike earlier U-boats that functioned largely as surface ships capable of submerging briefly, the Type XXI was designed to remain underwater for extended periods. With greater battery capacity and streamlined construction, it could travel faster beneath the waves than on the surface. In theory, it could have restored Germany's naval dominance. But theory is not war. Allied bombing disrupted production lines. Fuel shortages limited training exercises. Skilled crews were scarce. By the time the first Type XXI submarines became operational in 1945, the war was effectively lost. While submarine bunkers lined the coasts, deeper secrets were carved into mountains. In Austria, near St. Georgen and Der Gusen, the vast underground complex known as Bergkristall produced the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied aircraft of its time. Its 4 cannons could tear through bomber formations in seconds. Pilots described it as a glimpse into the future of air combat. Yet the aircraft's development was plagued by strategic confusion. Adolf Hitler insisted at times that the Me-262 be used as a bomber rather than a pure interceptor, delaying its effective deployment. Meanwhile, Allied forces targeted fuel refineries, crippling Germany's ability to supply its advanced machines. The jet engines themselves were fragile and required careful handling, something nearly impossible amid the chaos of collapsing infrastructure. Inside Bergkristall and similar underground facilities, forced laborers assembled jet components in suffocating conditions. Prisoners were transported daily from nearby camps, driven to exhaustion by impossible quotas. As with the V-2 program at Nordhausen, the human cost was staggering. Thousands perished building machines that would arrive too late to alter history. But the Reich's ambitions stretched even further. In the forests and mountains of Lower Silesia, today part of Poland, the enigmatic Project Reese expanded relentlessly. Massive tunnels snaked through the Owl Mountains. Reinforced chambers hinted at future command centers or weapons laboratories. Historians continue to debate the ultimate purpose of Reese. Some believe it was intended as a relocated Führer headquarters. Others argue it was designed to house advanced weapons production. What remains certain is that thousands of forced laborers died excavating its passages, many buried in unmarked graves scattered through the region. As Soviet forces advanced westward after crushing German armies in operations that began near Kursk and surged through Eastern Europe, the urgency of these underground projects intensified. Entire factories were dismantled and shipped deeper into German territory. Trains carrying machinery, blueprints, and prisoners moved constantly, often under Allied air attack. Above ground, the cities of the Reich faced annihilation. In February 1945, the bombing of Dresden created a firestorm that consumed much of the historic city. Flames generated hurricane-force winds. Tens of thousands of civilians perished. The psychological shock was immense. Yet even as Dresden burned, underground facilities continued to operate in other regions, insulated, at least temporarily, from the destruction above. The Nazi leadership clung to the belief that Wunderwaffen might still shift the balance. Beyond the V-1 and V-2, plans existed for the V-3 supergun, intended to bombard London from massive underground installations in occupied France. Though partially constructed, Allied bombing raids neutralized the project before it could become operational. Even more ambitious were proposals for the Amerika bomber, a long-range aircraft capable of striking the United States. Designs were drafted, prototypes were tested, But material shortages, bombing disruptions, and shifting priorities kept the concept from moving beyond experimental stages. Meanwhile, the Red Army closed in on Berlin. In January 1945, Soviet forces launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, advancing hundreds of kilometers in weeks. German defenses crumbled. Refugees clogged frozen roads. SS units enforced brutal discipline, executing those accused of desertion or defeatism. Amid this collapse, production orders continued to flow from Berlin's command structures, many now operating from underground bunkers. The most symbolic of these was the Führerbunker itself, buried beneath the Reich Chancellery. As artillery shells began striking the capital, Adolf Hitler withdrew into this subterranean refuge. The image was stark. The architect of a regime obsessed with monumental architecture and grand spectacle now confined beneath rubble and concrete. Even then, orders were issued for non-existent divisions to counterattack. Fantasies of secret weapons persisted. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels spoke of miraculous reversals, but outside the bunker walls, Soviet troops advanced street by street. In the underground factories still functioning in early 1945, production slowed as supply chains disintegrated. Electricity faltered. Raw materials failed to arrive. Guards abandoned posts. In some tunnels, prisoners were left to fend for themselves as SS personnel fled. In others, evacuation orders triggered brutal death marches toward the interior of Germany. When American forces liberated Mittelbau-Dora in April 1945, they encountered scenes of horror that stunned even hardened soldiers. Emaciated survivors emerged from the tunnels. Corpses lay stacked near railway sidings. The industrial heart of the V2 program was revealed not as a symbol of technological brilliance, but as a monument to cruelty. As Allied armies converged on Berlin, the underground Reich collapsed from within. On April 30, 1945, Hitler died in his bunker. Days later, German forces surrendered unconditionally. But the story did not end there. In the immediate aftermath, Allied intelligence teams raced to secure documents, prototypes, and scientific personnel before rival powers could seize them. In areas overrun by the Soviets, entire factories were dismantled and transported east. In the western zones, American forces initiated operations to capture German scientists and engineers. Among them was Wernher von Braun, whose expertise in rocketry would soon be redirected toward American military and space programs. The same knowledge used to rain destruction on European cities would later help propel humans to the moon. The moral complexities of this transition continue to provoke debate among historians. The underground facilities themselves remained, silent cavities within mountains. Some were sealed, others were repurposed. A few became memorial sites honoring the victims who suffered within their walls. The underground Reich had been born of desperation, a regime driven beneath the surface by overwhelming force. It revealed the terrifying intersection of advanced technology and totalitarian control. Even as defeat loomed, the machinery of war continued to grind forward, sustained by coercion and illusion. In the end, the mountains could not save the Reich. Concrete could not shield ideology from collapse, and the tunnels, once filled with the noise of machinery and the cries of prisoners, became echoes of a regime that believed it could outlast reality by retreating underground. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, a different kind of war began. The Third Reich had collapsed. Berlin lay in ruins. Its leaders were dead, captured, or in hiding. Yet scattered across Germany and occupied Europe were the remnants of an immense technological apparatus: rockets, jet engines, submarine prototypes, research archives, and the scientists who had built them. The underground factories had not only produced weapons, they had produced knowledge. And in the fragile first days of peace, that knowledge became the most valuable prize of all. Allied commanders understood this immediately. Even before Germany formally surrendered, specialized intelligence teams were moving behind advancing front lines. One such mission, led by American forces, targeted the Harz Mountains near Nordhausen, the site of the V-2 rocket's underground production complex. There, in the tunnels of Mittelwerk and the adjacent Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, U.S. troops uncovered not only advanced rocket components but detailed engineering drawings, test data, and partially assembled missiles. But the Americans were not alone in this race. From the east, Soviet forces swept through territories that contained critical industrial sites. Entire factories were dismantled piece by piece and loaded onto trains bound for the Soviet Union. Equipment, machine tools, even sections of underground tunnel infrastructure were relocated. German engineers were interrogated, recruited, or compelled to continue their work under Soviet supervision. The race was no longer about defeating Germany. It was about inheriting its future. Among the most sought-after individuals was Wernher von Braun, the chief architect behind the V-2 rocket program. As the war ended, von Braun and many of his colleagues deliberately surrendered to American forces, fearing Soviet capture. They understood their value. The knowledge required to build long-range rockets capable of reaching the edge of space was rare, and in the emerging geopolitical climate, it was priceless. In the months that followed, the United States initiated a covert program known as Operation Paperclip. Its purpose was clear: identify, evaluate, and relocate German scientists whose expertise could strengthen American military and technological capabilities. Rocket engineers, aeronautical designers, chemists, and physicists were transported across the Atlantic. Many had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had been directly involved in programs that relied on forced labor. The moral contradictions were profound. In the underground tunnels of the Harz Mountains, thousands had died assembling V-2 rockets. Yet the same technology that devastated cities like London and Antwerp would soon serve as the foundation for America's ballistic missile program, and eventually its space exploration efforts. Within 2 decades, rockets derived from V-2 designs would propel satellites into orbit and astronauts toward the moon. The Soviet Union pursued a similar path. German specialists were relocated eastward to assist in rebuilding and advancing Soviet rocket research. Facilities were reconstructed in secret locations. Former enemies became reluctant contributors to a new arms race that was already taking shape. Thus, from the ashes of the underground Reich emerged the technological seeds of the Cold War. Meanwhile, Allied investigators began documenting the human cost of the subterranean war economy. The liberation of camps such as Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp revealed the scale of forced labor that had sustained underground production. Survivors testified about endless shifts in suffocating tunnels, malnutrition, beatings, and executions. The industrial miracle that Nazi propaganda once celebrated was exposed as a machinery of exploitation. In 1945 and 1946, the Nuremberg trials sought to hold surviving leaders accountable. Among those prosecuted was Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments who had overseen the vast reorganization of German industry. Speer admitted moral responsibility for the use of forced labor, though historians continue to debate the extent of his knowledge regarding the full brutality of the concentration camp system. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The trials underscored a central truth: technological advancement cannot be separated from the system that produces it. The tunnels and rockets were not isolated achievements. They were products of a regime built on coercion and racial ideology. Yet even as legal proceedings unfolded, geopolitical tensions hardened. By 1947, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had begun to fracture. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe. Former wartime partners viewed each other with suspicion. In both Washington and Moscow, former Nazi research became integrated into national defense strategies. Ballistic missile development accelerated. Long-range delivery systems, descendants of the V-2, were now envisioned as carriers not just of conventional explosives, but of nuclear warheads. The underground Reich had vanished, but its technological legacy had reshaped global power. Back in Germany, many of the subterranean facilities were abandoned. Some tunnels were sealed with concrete, others were stripped for scrap. In certain regions, local communities avoided the sites altogether, haunted by their history. Over time, memorials were established to honor those who perished within them. The silence inside these caverns carried a weight that no machinery could erase. In the Owl Mountains of former Project Reese, incomplete corridors still wind through rock, their purpose never fully realized. In Austria, sections of former jet production tunnels remain as stark reminders of industrialized desperation. Along the Atlantic coast, massive U-boat bunkers stand like gray monuments, too solid to demolish, too grim to ignore. The underground Reich had been conceived as a sanctuary for survival. Instead, it became a symbol of a regime retreating from reality. Its leaders believed that steel, concrete, and advanced engineering could compensate for strategic collapse and moral bankruptcy. They believed that if the war could not be won above ground, it might be salvaged below it. But war is not only a contest of machines. It is a contest of resources, alliances, morale, and legitimacy. By 1945, Germany had lost on all those fronts. And yet the story does not end solely in condemnation. It serves as a warning. The same scientific brilliance that enabled rocket propulsion and jet aviation also thrived under authoritarian command. The underground factories demonstrate how innovation can be weaponized when detached from ethical restraint. They remind us that progress alone is not virtue. Without accountability, technological advancement can deepen destruction rather than elevate humanity. In the decades that followed, rockets inspired by early German designs would carry satellites that connect continents, probe distant planets, and expand scientific knowledge. Humanity reached space using principles refined in wartime tunnels. The contrast is stark. Tools once forged in darkness now exploring the cosmos. But history remembers the cost. The underground Reich was not merely an engineering effort. It was the final expression of a collapsing ideology, a belief that secrecy, force, and technological miracles could override overwhelming reality. Beneath mountains and concrete, the regime attempted to outlast its enemies. Instead, it exposed the limits of power divorced from humanity. Today, when visitors walk through preserved tunnels or stand before the remains of rocket assembly halls, they confront both ingenuity and atrocity intertwined. The echo of machinery has faded, but the lessons remain. Empires can dig deep. They can build vast fortresses of steel and stone. They can chase miracle weapons to the edge of imagination. But no regime can bury the consequences of its own actions forever.